Hello, and welcome to the TPI Aspen panel on Section 230 and the election. I'm Sarah O, Senior Fellow at the Technology Policy Institute. In 2020, more content is viewed online than ever before, in near real time, with instant uploads of video, chat, and news around the world. Not all user-generated content is good, but how much intermediary liability should there be for the bad? And who gets to decide what is bad? Should Section 230 be reformed? And if so, how? Does democracy depend on it? Or are politicians using it for their own purposes in the election cycle? Today, we're pleased to host a panel of experts to discuss what happens next in Section 230 policy. First, I'll briefly introduce our panelists. Eric Goldman is professor of law and co-director of the High Tech Law Institute at Santa Clara University School of Law, and one of the foremost experts in Section 230 scholarship. Alexandra Reeve Gibbons is president and CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology, and a leading voice in advocating for democracy and individual rights at the center of the digital revolution. Neil Freed is principal of DigitalFrontiers Advocacy and a practitioner with a decade of experience as chief counsel on the Hill and at the Motion Picture Association. Jamie Suskind is VP of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at the Consumer Technology Association, with experience as a senior staffer on the Hill and the FCC. Karl Herchenroeder is assistant editor at Communications Daily and a reporter providing coverage of legislative activity on Capitol Hill. I wanted to start the discussion today by asking each of you to make your case for how we should think about Section 230 at this moment before the November election. There are many moving pieces in Section 230 policy today, from the DOJ's Section 230 conference earlier this year, to the president's executive order over the summer, to NTIA's petition, to the FCC's request for comment, and now as of this afternoon, a rulemaking proceeding, to the U.S. District Court's pending response to CDT's request for injunctive relief, several proposed bills, including draft legislation by the DOJ relating to content moderation, Justice Thomas weighing in on Section 230 in the Malwarebytes case, YouTube making new efforts to take down QAnon content, and a recent decision by Twitter and Facebook to block a link to a New York Post article. On October 28th coming up, Jack Dorsey, Mark Zuckerberg, and Sundar Pichai are set to testify on Section 230 to the Senate Commerce Committee, but now there's talk of a vote in the Senate Judiciary Committee for them to appear Friday, October 23rd, the day of our live Q&A, which will follow this session. How much of this activity around Section 230 will continue or stop, depending on which administration is in office in January? How much of this activity is pre-election posturing? So we'll start with Eric, and then we'll hear from Alexandra, Neil, Jamie, and Karl, and then have a brief discussion and move to live Q&A with audience questions.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks for convening this conversation. I expect that Section 230 will only continue to garner significant attention from various government regulatory bodies as soon as we get past the election, and maybe even beforehand, but certainly past the election, I expect there to be a flood of new activity related to Section 230. And as regulators are evaluating this, I would suggest they should consider 3 points. One is that they should remember all the good that Section 230 does, all the different ways in which it helps us obtain new and socially valuable technologies and helps give voices to people who might not otherwise have them, including people in marginalized communities that otherwise are frozen out from the media ecosystem. The fact we're able to have this conversation today is in part due to Section 230. So we should make sure to preserve our ability to have these kinds of conversations in the future. The second point I'd make is that whatever reform effort is initiated, it should be clear how that fixes a problem. And one of my biggest frustrations about potential reforms of Section 230 is that they seem more directed at general techlash or at Section 230 as a concept, not actually in trying to solve a specific problem and ensuring that the solution fits the problem. So when I talk to staffers on the Hill, for example, about their proposed bills, I'm often really drilling down, what do you think is going to happen in response to this bill? And will that be what you want to have happen? And I think those conversations are essential for any Section 230 reform. Does the solution, does the solution actually fix the problem, and what other problems is it going to create? The final thing I'll suggest about any discussion on Section 230 reform is to make sure that we don't change Section 230 only to find that that doesn't actually have the capacity to solve the problem, because even without Section 230, we're still going to see the same behavior. And that could be because, for example, the behavior is protected by the Constitution, that the First Amendment will act as a backstop. So eliminating Section 230 won't change the outcomes. It will only take away the protection, the protective benefits that Section 230 provides. Or it could be that internet companies are being asked to basically eliminate what we call lawful but awful content, that they are actually being asked to remove lawful content. So they're being asked to go beyond what the law requires. Or the third reason is that they are being asked to basically make humans be nicer to each other than we actually are. That internet companies are being held to blame for the fact that people are often awful to each other, and that can't be fixed. And reforming Section 230 won't make people nicer to each other. So I think there's a lot to discuss with any Section 230 reform proposals. I think we'll have a lot of them to discuss, but I do hope that we'll keep in mind some of those principles.
So on my end, it's absolutely right. The debate about Section 230 has continued for a while. In thinking about the current timeline, what we're really seeing, however, is that the debate has taken on a new tenor with the executive order, the NTIA petition, legislation from Senator Graham that's been held over for the past few weeks for markup in the Senate Judiciary Committee. As you mentioned, Sarah, Chairman Pai recently announced that the FCC will go ahead with a rulemaking on Section 230. And in his announcement, he cited bipartisan support for taking a look at the law. But as we look at the different conversations, I think it's really important to see that one of these things is not like the other. When we look at the executive order, the NTIA petition, and the types of legislation coming from Senator Graham and others, instead of asking whether platforms are doing enough to respond to dangerous speech on their platforms, these actually go the other way. They're actively seeking to curtail platforms' ability to moderate content on their services. You can see the differing motivations here by when you look at what's on that list versus what isn't. So under Senator Graham's bill, for example, a platform receives Good Samaritan protection for responding to terrorism-related content, but not for responding to hate speech, voter suppression, misinformation about COVID-19, or other examples we can think of. Moreover, the efforts not only target moderating through takedowns, but also platforms' ability to provide commentary on the types of user-generated content that's posted on their services. In my mind, and from CDT's perspective, these are a very dangerous development, and they point to just the increasing politicization of Section 230. You can see similar efforts in the list that the Department of Justice has been ordered to compile under the executive order of websites that don't demonstrate political neutrality. These efforts all send a clear message to intimidate platforms from responding to voter suppression and misinformation on their services. And they violate the First Amendment, which is why CDT filed its lawsuit to challenge the constitutionality of the EO. Thinking about this question of how things will change after the election, I do think realistically that either way these conversations will continue. What I hope is that the current efforts do serve as a reminder for those who dislike 230 because they think platforms are doing too little. What we need to remember is that 230 is the underpinning that allows platforms to respond to things like misinformation, hate speech, and voter suppression on their services in a way, as Eric mentioned, that no US statute could ever mandate because of the First Amendment. So it plays a really critical role in the ecosystem that we need to make sure we preserve and continue to protect through these ongoing conversations. From CDT's perspective, we're focused on urging companies to continue building out processes that help add visibility, fairness, speed, consistency to content moderation practices. That includes things like having clear and consistent rules and policies, having processes in place to help people appeal both removals and decisions to keep up content. And I think it also, what we'll see is a continued innovation by the companies to improve and enhance some of their tools. We're already seeing very rapid iteration under this pressure cooker of the upcoming election. And I anticipate that that will continue as well. So what do I mean by that? This is things like realizing that there are more tools than just removal. There's providing contextual information. There are click-through screens. There's choosing not to promote items in the recommendation engine. There's also really important conversations happening about more rigorous ways to give visibility into when and how content moderation decisions are made, including through partnerships with nonprofits that could do better auditing to understand what's happening on these services. And I expect we'll see continued refinement and conversations around models that bring more voices into the decision-making processes. The Facebook Oversight Board has obviously been one example of that, but I anticipate we'll see more innovation around advisory councils and other processes to add this to the mix. The final point I'll add is that we all need to be looking at what's happening in Europe as well, where the Digital Services Act is raising all of these questions in a really significant way.
By thanking TPI for inviting me to participate today. I always look forward to this event. I look forward to the time when we can actually do this in person again, although I must admit I had a slightly smoother travel experience this year than I did the past couple. But I always do look forward to this, so thank you. I think the main point I want to communicate is that despite conventional wisdom and despite the best interests and intent of Congress, Section 230 actually makes content moderation less likely and thus makes consumers less safe on the internet. And most of that is because of the way that courts have applied Section 230. So Section 230C2 does in fact protect the platforms when they actually moderate content. And I think that's a good thing. The problem is that Section 230C1 provides a shield even if a platform does zero moderation. And in fact, courts have applied 230C1 to say that a platform has a liability shield even if they negligently, recklessly, or knowingly facilitate illegal activity. That's a problem. That's completely opposite of what Congress intended coming out of the Stratton-Oakmont case. They wanted to encourage platform moderation. And troublingly, a recent study from the Internet Association suggests that 91% of all takedowns, of all dismissals under Section 230 occur under 230C1, not C2. So again, 230 is not actually doing what we all want, which is taking down harmful content. It's just giving a free pass to platforms if and when they actually act recklessly. So the best thing we should do, I think, is for Congress to take another look and explicitly condition the protection of Section 230 on taking reasonable steps to curtail illicit activity over their platforms. That's the best result. Short of that, the FCC actually could take some action on its own to actually reconstrue Section 230. The Supreme Court has made clear that agencies can construe statutory provisions within their statutes, and that in fact, as long as that's a reasonable interpretation, subsequent courts have to abide by those interpretations. And so just like Congress could explicitly make clear that there is some obligation to take reasonable steps to curb illicit activity, the FCC could provide a much more rational interpretation of Section 230. And this is something that actually Justice Thomas just pointed out. Certainly there are a variety of reasonable interpretations of the statute, but one that makes more sense in fulfilling the objectives of Congress would be to say that C1 only does what C1 actually says, which it prevents liability for a platform being treated as either a speaker or a publisher. C1 says nothing about liability and says nothing about distributors. And as Justice Thomas points out, and as many of us have pointed out in our comments, either in testimony before Congress or in filings at the FCC could reasonably construe that C1 only prohibits actual liability as a speaker or a publisher, not as a distributor. If a platform is aware of illicit activity, is aware of defamation, it could conceivably be held liable under the ordinary analysis of libel law, subject, of course, to First Amendment protections. C1, right, only applies when there's no content moderation, and I don't think it was ever meant to create a complete shield even for reckless behavior. This would leave C2, whether it's done by Congress or whether it's done by the FCC, importantly, this would leave the C2 shield for when platforms actually do moderate content, the protection we really do want them to have to voluntarily keep the internet as productive, as healthy as possible. So C2 would not change. The platforms would still have the ability to curtail harmful and illicit activity. That would be helpful. We would still have that protection. This would not amount to regulation. This would just be a rule of interpretation for courts to apply. The FCC would not be regulating the internet. This also would not hurt smaller providers, as long as there's a reasonable effort test, which is what there would be under this interpretation. What's reasonable for a small provider is different than what's reasonable for a large provider. Larger providers will be presumed to be able to do more to combat illicit activity on their platforms. And because they're bigger, the risk of illicit activity is greater. Smaller platforms will have fewer resources, likely have less illicit activity happening on their platforms. And so this sort of standard will not be a barrier to upstarts. In all, I think this is a much healthier interpretation, a rational interpretation. And whether it's done by Congress or done by the FCC, I think it helps us really achieve what Congress wanted, is to get the most and the best out of the internet and curb the worst.
So thanks so much, TPI, for inviting me to join you for part of this important discussion today. For those who don't know CTA represents the world's leading innovators from startups to global brands, and the success of many of our members are due in no small part to Section 230 protections. In fact, it's our view that Section 230 is a key reason why American companies are the world's default choices for things like entertainment, communications, and commerce. It's the reason why startups can launch without facing massive liability, why internets can host third-party reviews, and individuals like you or I can freely express our opinions online, no matter how ridiculous or off-base they might be. So as Sarah said, there's definitely a lot going on in this space right now. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the FCC comments, which is especially timely given Chairman Pai's announcement today that they plan to move forward with a rulemaking proceeding. So CTA actually filed 2 sets of comments in the FCC's proceeding, and we focused really on 4 key arguments. But I will say that a lot of these arguments are also generally applicable to other activity in this space, whether that's the president's executive order, bills in Congress, other conversations that are going on. I won't speak to the Supreme Court because I think I would know better than to speak to the Supreme Court and question them. But first, we talked a little bit about innovation policy. And frankly, it's shocking to us that our own government would look to undermine a law that's led to unprecedented American innovation by American companies with massive benefits for the US economy and US consumers. Additionally, we're concerned a little bit about jurisdiction in this space. It sounded like from Chairman Pai's statement that they're a little bit less concerned, but it's our view that NTIA doesn't have the legal authority to add new laws for the FCC to follow, and that's the role of Congress. Additionally, the FCC can't, whether or not 230 is within their organic statute, the FCC can't direct providers to do something. They can't order something that would contradict the exact text of the statute. So for example, the statute doesn't talk about a reasonable efforts test. It doesn't have notice requirements. It doesn't look to otherwise limit the phrase otherwise objectionable. There's things in there that folks have sort of thrown around that are just completely contradictory with the face of the statute. Certainly we have First Amendment concerns, which CDT has also raised, obviously very well. Regulating online free speech would basically be akin to the government picking winners and losers. Platforms have First Amendment protection to moderate the speech on their platforms for better or for worse. We can disagree with the decisions that they make, but that doesn't make the First Amendment go away. And we are very concerned about the government putting its nose sort of into the tent here and getting engaged in those conversations. And frankly, I think any Americans who care about democracy and care about freedom should also share our concerns. Lastly, the thing that we're really concerned about is that if we weaken Section 230 protections, the country that's hot on our heels in tech innovation and tech leadership is China. So China really stands to benefit from weakening the protections that are really uniquely American. As we said, American companies have really benefited from the unique protections that Section 230 provides. And I don't think we would want to cede our leadership in this space to other countries, particularly China, by weakening those protections. I would say that I had a lot of ideas in my mind about what might happen after the election. Perhaps that is changing each day as things shift in this space. I think largely, it will still depend on the election results themselves. I think that if Vice President Biden wins, we might see action shift away from the FCC. It might stay in Congress, but I don't think it will necessarily stay in the executive branch. But as I say, things are changing by the day in this space. Either way, our members would definitely welcome robust dialogue on these issues, and we're happy to continue engaging with anyone who wants to talk about them. I would, however, share a concern that Professor Goldman raised against a sweeping approach that basically tries to use Section 230 as kind of a catch-all remedy for greater concerns about techlash. I mean, certainly we're hearing concerns, about privacy. We do hear concerns about disinformation on the internet. And I mean, these are all serious things that should be talked about, and I don't think we would have any concerns about talking about them. We've spoken at CTA about a national privacy bill, for example. But we should make sure that we're specifically targeting the harms that are at issue here, and that whatever remedies that we are proposing are actually intended to specifically address those harms versus sort of a general sense of these companies are too big or they're scary or we just don't like the content that they're putting on their websites. Again, thank you so much to TPI for having me here today, and I look forward to the dialogue that continues.
First, I'd like to thank TPI for inviting me to speak today. Really appreciate it. Obviously, there's plenty to discuss. As a reporter, I'll try to stay away from offering opinions today, but I'm looking forward to offering context where I can about Capitol Hill. I started writing about the tech industry around the time that SESTA-FOSTA passed in 2018. Since passage, the conversation has only accelerated, particularly in the last few months since President Trump signed his executive order. A lot of people say that the executive order has fueled Republican proposals on the Hill, namely a proposal from Senators Wicker, Graham, and Blackburn. Opponents say the EO and the bill are similar in intent, that they were motivated by the GOP's perception that Silicon Valley is biased against conservatives. In recent tech hearings, many Republicans have focused a lot of their questions on Section 230. At a recent House Antitrust Subcommittee hearing, on that subcommittee's tech investigation, Jim Jordan pretty much focused all of his time on Section 230 and this claim that Silicon Valley is out to get conservatives. He and House Republicans that day introduced the Protect Speech Act, which would amend Section 230 and limit liability protections for platforms making editorial decisions. Democrats have been equally vocal about the statute, but they dismissed the bias claims as myth. Both parties seem determined to scrutinize the statute, but they're taking very different approaches. Democrats seem more focused on harmful content and getting the platforms maybe to take more action to take down this content. At this point, Section 230 seems to have supplanted privacy as the major focal point on the Hill. We've seen a little bit of bipartisan work in this area. Senators Thune and Schatz introduced legislation. The Pact Act would exempt enforcement of federal civil laws from Section 230. So platforms can't use it as a defense when federal regulators like the FTC and DOJ pursue civil actions for online activity. It's going to be interesting to see what kind of common ground legislators might find in the coming months, if any. Again, thank you for offering me the chance to speak today.
Thank you all for your thoughts. And now, I mean, there's so much to discuss. Well, I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on what happens in January, and there are proposals on the Hill. How would you like to see Section 230 reform, if at all? If there is going to be action here and it's bumped over to Congress or at the executive branch or at FCC, what would you all like to see?
I'm happy to start. We're at an interesting moment, right? Because no one knows today who's going to hold the White House, who's going to hold the Senate, and who's going to be in charge at the FCC, which gives us a unique opportunity to all talk about what we think the right result should be, knowing that we may not be holding the pen, whoever you are, on whatever side of the political spectrum you're in. Hopefully we all talk about the right policy, and that takes the politics out of it, since we don't know who's got control. And again, the point I want to emphasize is that absent Section 230, platforms could be held accountable if they act recklessly. This is not injecting a new standard, but for Section 230, when a platform acts recklessly, a court might be able to hold them accountable for the harm they cause. Now, this is not automatic. There still has to be a full proceeding in court about whether or not someone's been harmed and that harm has been caused by a platform and the platform was unreasonable or reckless or knowingly acting without taking care of the moderation that would prevent that harm. That's the kind of amendment I think that would solve everyone's concerns. There was a bipartisan concern that people are being harmed online because platforms are not doing enough. And that's a bipartisan solution that I hope we can all agree on. The speech issues are more challenging because, of course, whether you're worried about bias or hate speech, you have the same obstacle, which is the First Amendment. And I think the Supreme Court has been clear, and I think will continue to be clear, that platforms have First Amendment rights. When it comes to stuff like speech, maybe the solution is something along the lines of transparency and making clear that when a platform makes a promise, it must honor that promise. The FCC could consider, or Congress could consider, creating transparency requirements, creating process requirements so that someone knows how they might be taken down and what their rights are to challenge that takedown. Those might be bipartisan solutions that help everybody's concern. And again, now might be the time to talk about that since none of us know who's holding the pen in January.
Sure. So I think that at CTA, our position is that the appropriate place to deal with any reforms, if reforms are appropriate, is Congress. We feel fairly strongly that the FCC does not have the appropriate jurisdiction to do this. In our comments, we talked a lot about transparency. And when I worked at the FCC, I did work on the Restoring Internet Freedom Order and dealt with some of the transparency regulations for ISPs. And the language of the particular statutory provision that the FCC is leaning on here is different. It is different in how it is phrased for ISPs, information service providers, versus edge providers. And the FCC in 2017 actually kind of dismissed the idea that they could regulate edge providers under the same standard. Certainly the FCC could go back and then they could open a proceeding. I think they would need notice and comment to do it, and maybe that's what they'll try to do. But we do think that it's a stretch. We did not think that for edge providers, the language of the statute really called for these requirements. It's really just a one-time reporting requirement from back in 1996. We did not see that as providing the basis for transparency. If it's Congress, I think that's a different conversation, but at the FCC, I think no.
Neil, I have a question for you. In your introductory remarks, you made the claim that Section 230 makes content moderation less likely. And I was just curious what kind of empirical support you had for that claim?
Sure. So absent Section 230, a platform would be subject to ordinary tort law. Now, in other words, they could be hauled into court and actually could lose a case if a court found, based on someone's complaint, that they had been irresponsible and someone was harmed because of it. If you look at the Internet Association study just recently completed, 91% of the dismissals under Section 230 happen under 230C1. C1 requires no content moderation, 0. And so what that means is that absent any liability, platforms have less incentive to moderate. It's just there's less legal or economic incentive to do so. And we're seeing cases, whether it's Dirty World versus Jones or Grindr versus Herrick. And this is just a couple of the ones that bubble to the top because they're big cases. If you look at a lot of studies from a lot of the victims groups, a lot of the anti-terrorism groups, there's a lot of awful stuff happening on the internet. I'm not suggesting that platforms are responsible for all those things, but I think there's a decent chance that they're being reckless with at least some of them. And because of 230, we can't even question. No victim can get through the courthouse door to say, you know what? They knew about this. There were reasonable things they could do and they haven't done them. I think courts should be able to hear those cases. Victims should be able to bring those cases. They may not win, but they should, just like any other victim of a crime, because of the negligence of someone else, they should be able to make that case. And those cases can't be made today because of a overbroad application of Section 230 by the courts. And there was a reasonable construction of 230 that solves that problem and does what Congress intended, which is promote actual moderation, a legal provision that says, here's the benefit if you moderate. You get protection from liability if you moderate. You don't get protection if you don't moderate. They may still win the case, but at least we can have the case heard.
I'm so sorry, I wasn't clear. I asked you for empirical evidence of the fact that content moderation is less likely.
So if you
You
look
give me
at,
theoretical arguments, but actually that doesn't track the reality that I see, where I see internet companies working very hard to try and do content moderation. So it's fine for you to make the theoretical argument. I understand it. I don't agree with it. But if you're going to make an empirical argument, I'd like to see the data.
yeah, so if you look at studies by Gretchen Peters' group, Digital Citizens Alliance, there are lots of studies. The victims groups are all talking about the increase in child sexual abuse materials, trafficking of drugs. All these things are happening online. And you're right. I mean, just like Congress couldn't know precisely the outcome of the 230 they wrote and the way the court applied it, we can't know with certainty. But what we do know today is that no one gets to question whether the right incentives would improve the situation online. And so that's the real point here.
So sorry again. I think you and I are just talking right past each other, because higher incidence of illicit or illegal conduct doesn't support your claim that content moderation is taking place less. And so I just want to be clear, if you want to argue about the content moderation quantum, then I need to see the data related to that.
But you realize it's impossible to do because under current law, there's no obligation to do so. There's no way to test without changing the law how platforms will react with a different law. What I can tell you is there's a lot of harm on the internet, and some of that harm may not occur if platforms had to do a better job of curbing it. I might be wrong, but that's fine, right? If the courts can actually hear these cases, if the victims can bring their cases, and it turns out after court review, we find they're doing everything they should, fine, that's the right result. I'm not saying the platforms have to be liable, but we can't even ask that question. All tort liability for any industry is meant to make sure that people who've been hurt have somewhere to go. And that's all we're talking about. I can't prove there will be more content moderation, because we have a law that says it doesn't have to occur.
For many of these points, I'm sure they'll be raised in hearings with the CEOs of the companies that are coming up soon. Twitter, Facebook, Google will soon be talking about these topics. How do you think Section 230 can be distinguished from all the other harms that are claimed, like antitrust, big companies versus small, election interference? Do you have any thoughts about how to have a productive conversation around Section 230 between now and the next few months?
I mean to say, I do think it's really important that we try to focus on the specific harms at question and how we try to address them. And the reason is this isn't tort liability in the abstract, right? Where we're thinking only about the liability of the companies. What we care about is how that liability framework ends up affecting the free speech of users that are trying to use platforms to communicate, gain access to information, build community, have their voices heard. And the real risk here is when that balance of incentives shifts, when the legal regime ratchets up in a way that companies feel that they need to over-moderate to be able to monitor this contact because they're going to be responsible for what happens online, there's a real significant impact of chilling effects on the rights of free speech. Karl mentioned Sesta Foster earlier in his remarks, and I think that's a really important teaching moment, right? That legislation was introduced with noble intent. It was voted for with noble intent. But when you look at what the consequences have been, the effects have been far bigger than addressing trafficking online. And instead, what we've seen, there's been good empirical research about this coming out of the Berkman Klein Center and elsewhere, is a chilling effect on support groups that were finding each other online, that were taken down because companies feared that they might be exposed to liability. My takeaway from that is that we just need to be careful, deliberative, thoughtful, and grounded in the evidence here to try and get the most narrowly tailored discussion that we have. And to the point that was raised earlier, we also just need to realize that there are a bunch of different tools on the table. So Section 230 can be one discussion. Commercial pressure on the companies should and can be another. We're seeing a significant movement around that right now that is leading to material change in how some of the companies are approaching these questions. But federal privacy legislation is another one that is an absolute top priority to protect consumers today. That is an issue that people care about at home. It is a voting issue. It is a kitchen table issue for people to have their data protected. We need to be thinking about the full suite of these tools and how they fit together, as opposed to looking for grand sweeping changes that will end up having a disproportionate impact on marginalized communities and the users that we're trying to help.
I was going to say that I am concerned that we don't have a clear sense of what our concerns are. I think that, you know, we hear things about, even just today, right, conservative bias, and that's a very different conversation than the one I think we've been having with Neil about under moderation. And so the fact that, you know, we're hearing things that are kind of diametrically opposed makes me wonder about, are we really in the position to be talking about 230 reforms, or are there other things that we should be targeting? You know, are 230 reforms really the way to talk about things like bias or things like disinformation? Maybe they're not the right venue for that. You know, if it's about the amount of moderation, under moderation, maybe, I mean, maybe, but I think before we have a targeted sense of what exactly folks are concerned about, and even people can get together from both sides of the aisle and have that conversation with each other, maybe this is premature and we really need to take a more thoughtful approach.
I just wanted to say that whatever proposal rises to the top on Capitol Hill, they're going to have to get over this hurdle of political bias, because I don't see guys like Jim Jordan letting that go. So they're going to have to come to some kind of common ground on that if a bipartisan legislation is going to pass.
The good news there is that at bottom, the obstacle for those that are concerned about bias and hate speech is the same thing. It's the First Amendment. So I do think that transparency can help both sides, which may be the bipartisan bridge, right? If we create more transparency, if we have the ability to enforce reasonable due process around the way in which someone's content either is left up or taken down, right? Some people are concerned that content is left up. Some people are concerned that content is taken down. Either way, there can be process and transparency around that. And that transparency will help both people that are concerned about bias and people that are concerned about hate speech. That could be a bipartisan bridge on the speech issues. And I think there's already bipartisan concern about the illicit activity that's harming people. So I think there's a path forward. We just have to get there.
And I think what you're talking about, Schatz and Thune address that in their legislation. But the thing is, that legislation is not, I don't really think that legislation has garnered the attention that the partisan bills have, maybe because the backlash is stronger.
Well, again, hopefully when we know who's got the pen and we're through the election, we can get these bipartisan conversations happening and focus, as I think every panelist has said, on real concrete harms and tailor whatever we do to Section 230 to address those things. Again, we have certain restrictions, right? You have the First Amendment. I think the Supreme Court has said, right, the First Amendment's going to apply to platforms. It doesn't mean there's nothing we can do. It's worth trying.
Sarah, can I go back to your question? You asked the question, how are we going to have a well-informed discussion about moving forward any evaluation of Section 230? And honestly, I've become really skeptical about our ability to do so because of the fact that we have things like the executive order from Trump, we have the NTIA petition to the FCC, and we have things like Justice Thomas's a statement about Section 230, each of which are filled with really gross inaccuracies about the state of the law and about what the law actually says. And as long as the government, as long as the taxpayer-funded mouthpieces are misportraying what Section 230 says and does, I don't see how we can really have a productive conversation. It devolves down into, are you for or against tech, or are you for or against free speech? And that's really where we see the dialogue taking place. And I don't know how we're going to get around that. The only possible way is to get the government to stop misportraying what Section 230 says and does.
Eric, can I follow up on that? You mentioned that there was misstatements of law in Justice Thomas's statement about Section 230. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, pretty much. I have a sentence by sentence deconstruction of the opinion and all of the things that's wrong with it. There's almost very little there that's useful. And so I can't do that. It's 2,700 words. I think I'd eat up all our remaining time. But really, there's nothing right in it. It's only filled with misstatements. And there's no reason not to expect that. Justice Thomas was not briefed on Section 230C1. The parties didn't litigate that issue. And at the end, he says that the parties haven't briefed this issue, so we'll have to leave this for another day. So the first 10 pages, he's talking about stuff he acknowledged he wasn't actually properly briefed on.
On that note, I think I'll transition us to our live Q&A, which is a week later, and I'm sure there's going to be new developments to discuss, and I hope audience members are putting in their questions, and we'll answer them right now. Since our recording last Thursday, more things have happened on the Section 230 front. The FCC's General Counsel released a blog post outlining its reasoning for rulemaking authority in Section 230 just on Wednesday. The Senate Judiciary Committee voted on sending subpoenas to Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey yesterday for the blocking of a New York Post article. Senator Graham put the Online Content Moderation Act bill into the Senate Judiciary Committee business meeting agenda yesterday. And the Section 230 bill tracker lists are getting longer, with new bills coming out each day. Facebook's Oversight Board has started taking cases, according to news articles yesterday. And there's been a little bit more time for scholars to analyze Justice Thomas's statement in the cert denial in the Malwarebytes case from the Ninth Circuit. So first, I wanted to ask any of the panelists if they had comments on new developments over the last few days since we last recorded our discussion.
So I'm happy to talk about the FCC General Counsel's opinion, if that would be constructive. I think he did an excellent job of laying out the argument, and I understand why there's debate around what the FCC should do with that authority, but there really should be no debate about whether the FCC has that authority. That was settled long ago when the then Democratic FCC chairman, William Kennard, brought a case before the Supreme Court and won that argument on local competition issues. Reed Hunt had adopted, his predecessor had adopted an order that actually construed local pricing provisions that the act was clear were to be implemented by state utility commissions. And the court said that the plain language of 201B says that the FCC has general jurisdiction to implement its own statute. And that's where Section 230 lies. Now, that may not have been Congress's intent, but that's what Congress did. And all of Congress, all of the House and all the Senate voted on a bill that put Section 230 in the Communications Act. And the Communications Act is clear that provisions within it can be construed by the FCC. So I don't think it's a question on the FCC's authority. Where there should be debate is what does the FCC do with that authority?
Can I chime into the conversation, Sarah? So, I mean, I think first of all, as up high FCC, I'm actually kind of shocked that they were putting the analysis out there, not because they're not transparent, they are very transparent, but I feel like it commits you on paper to sort of a legal analysis. It also, frankly, sets forth instructions for an FCC that might be led by a different administration to use Section 230 as kind of an expansive source of authority going forward. So knowing how much time and effort was spent trying to shoot down things done under Section 706, I actually found the analysis that Tom put out surprising to me. I think that was a broader interpretation of their authority than I would have ever expected to see them using, and it actually concerns me that now going forward, no matter who's in charge, we're going to see Section 230 used as sort of a broader expansive authority for things. I won't go into the 201 case law, but I will say that the blog did not address several points that at least CTA raised in our comments, and maybe this goes to what Neil was saying about what the FCC should do with said authority. But I mean, we raised a lot of arguments basically about, the analysis ending at Chevron step 1, and they did use some words about ambiguity, but they certainly didn't rebut all of the arguments about congressional intent and the law being clear on its face. They did use ambiguity, but I don't know that they actually rebutted all of those arguments. We had made arguments about the transparency point that NTIA raised, and they didn't address it at all, which makes me wonder what they were thinking about it. It makes me wonder if that means they realize that transparency is kind of a no-go here, or if they're saving it to pull it out of their pocket at some other time. I think it just raised more questions for me than it necessarily answered. But I thank them for being transparent about it. I think we're just not sold.
And I actually think it's laudable, not only because it's transparent, but they're doing it now. And you made a very important point. This is FCC authority. It's FCC authority for a Democratic chairman. It's FCC authority for a Republican chairman. And it's long-standing, but it's the plain language in 201B. So and the reason why it doesn't talk about some of these other issues is they're not yet before the commission, right? The commission, if it's going to move forward, has to have some sort of process, that some sort of document that the commissioners can vote on. All the general counsel said is, this is what I believe the authority is, and presumably everyone will have an opportunity to comment on his blog as we move forward with it, in whatever form this takes, whether now or after the election. Everybody will have an opportunity to weigh in.
But I will say that what this suggests to me is that the limits of 201, meaning there are no limits, right? Like, hey, 201's in the Communications Act. Anything that we want to interpret, we can interpret. 201 is here, and this gives us expansive authority over basically anything in the world that we could read as falling into our statute. And I think that that is a concerning position. I don't know that that's the right position. I think that that is a concerning position.
But it's not anything. It's just things that are actually in the Communications Act. And this is not new, right? This is not 1999 was when the Supreme Court said this. We've known this. It's been used since then. It's been used in tower siting cases. It's been used in cable cases. It's nothing new. I believe there is a debate on what the FCC should do with that authority, but they didn't break any new ground here. The general counsel just stated the current state of law.
Sarah, the one thing I'll chime in to say is that separate from, we disagree with the 201B analysis here, in part because 230 is one of the few sections of the Act that really makes no reference to the Commission. And unlike other settings where the FCC has been pertaining to aspects of telecommunication services and the interpretations that they're making, here the FCC is stepping into brand new territory. And that's, I think, the most important takeaway from this is, try as you might, we can talk about the case law and different interpretations. That reasoning shouldn't distract from the fact that this effort is directly motivated by a political push by the administration. And to me, that's been the headline news coming out of Chairman Pai's decision to take up this petition. The entire justification for the NTIA petition has been clear. It's rooted in a partisan concern about platforms labeling and fact-checking the president's speech. That partisan underpinning for the executive order and for the NTIA petition and now for the FCC rulemaking taint this entire process from the beginning, and I think are really troubling.
But
I just wanted to say, I think
go ahead.
The series of events has been pretty incredible. I think when the executive order was signed, there were a lot of people out there that did not take it seriously whatsoever. And now here we are, all of a sudden we have an FCC rulemaking. And it all happened pretty quickly, just with those developments with Thomas's statement and then the New York Post article. It happened really quickly.
I want to emphasize, we shouldn't confuse the executive order with the FCC's authority, right? The FCC has that authority whether or not there was an executive order. And the FCC as a commission has to pass this. It is going to require at least 3 commissioners. And we do not yet know who those commissioners are going to be to pass this. And so I am genuine when I say we should all be working together to get the right policy, because we don't know who's holding the pen. And there is bipartisan agreement, more bipartisan agreement than people admit. And I'm hoping we see through that, see through the politics and the partisanship, and do something constructive with the authority that really, there's no question that the FCC has this authority. It's what does the FCC do?
So if the FCC had the authority, why didn't they do this sua sponte? Why did NTIA have to direct them to do it?
They very well could have, but obviously the importance of an issue rises and falls with what's happening around us, right? We have seen crisis upon crisis around internet responsibility lately. We didn't see those in 1999, right? There's a whole bunch of things happening around us, and agencies often look at issues afresh when things around them, when the circumstances of the day change. And I don't think there's anything inappropriate about that, right? Like, again, there is broad agreement that we have a problem, and the hope is that we can come together and find a good policy solution in a bipartisan fashion. And that could be now, it could be 6 months from now, and we don't know who's going to be writing that order. So let's all agree on what the right result is and all work together to make sure that we accomplish that right result, regardless of who holds the pen.
Neil, I'll take issue with you there. This was the comment that I was making in my opening remarks, that some of these efforts are not like the others, right? When you look at the content of the FCC proposal, the NTIA petition, these efforts are clearly grounded in a political concern that platforms are censoring conservative speech, right? There's no holds barred here in terms of the triggering events. President Trump was perfectly clear when he issued the executive order as to what those motivations were. And we're seeing the same thing translate into some of the legislative efforts on the Hill. So to say that there's bipartisan consensus that something needs to be done, I think is disingenuous when you look at the very different motivations at stake here. And as a result of very different consequences, both for Section 230 and for the types of problems that people are trying to address. These efforts, when we look at the FCC effort, when we look at what's happening in Senator Grimm and the Wicker bill, for example, is clearly a focus on threatening platforms' ability to respond to misinformation, voter suppression on their services. And that can't get lost in this conversation. I think it's really important that we continue to understand what the motivations here are and what the threat is for free speech when we have this idea that the government is now going to become the arbiter of political neutrality on a service and how they're moderating their content.
So if you listen yesterday, Chairman Pai quite clearly said he is not advocating a fairness doctrine for the internet. We have to remember that the executive branch and the FCC are two distinct entities, right? And every petitioner, every commenter expresses their own views. And every congressman and congresswoman and senator has their own motivations for the legislation they introduce. I'm not going to impugn anybody's motives. I'm just saying that there are protections in the First Amendment. There are clear rules about what the FCC can do in terms of process. And I think we can get the right result here because there is a middle where I think a lot of us agree. You're absolutely right. There is partisanship on some of the issues, but there are some where there isn't. And I'm hoping we can focus on the things we can accomplish. And both the executive order and those concerned about hate speech have a common concern. It's a lack of transparency. It's a concern that we don't really understand when, why, and how platforms make their decisions. And there are transparency provisions very much that apply, like what apply to broadband providers today, that could help that are constitutional, that don't run afoul of the First Amendment, right? We don't have to run into those free speech issues to solve a really important issue, which is people are being harmed, and there's a concern that no one can ever question what the platforms are doing. Like every other business, we can question whether they're being reckless or not. We can't question whether platforms are being reckless. And when platforms control so much of our economic and social and political lives right now, it just seems odd that we're carving out that sector of all the other sectors to not be accountable in court.
With FCC rulemaking, do you all foresee a similar docket of comments like the prior comment period? Or do you think there will be an injunction on this rulemaking before it can happen? Or in the next, in January, will the next FCC keep it going?
Well, I can't really enjoin, a notice is a notice, and they can put out a notice. I think they'll have to put out more specifics about what they would be proposing, or they'll risk whatever they do being found arbitrary and capricious in court. So hopefully there will be more specifics that folks can comment on. I'm still not sold that we'll see the NPRM before the end of the year, but like I was wrong before, I could be wrong again now. But I think maybe in 2 weeks we'll have a better sense. I think that, if it were hypothetically Commissioner Karl, yeah, we'll see something and maybe he'd even yank it and make it a declaratory ruling. If it were a Biden administration, I don't think, and I think I've said before, I don't think the FCC has an interest in doing this. I think that Congress probably still will, but the FCC, no.
So to move on to maybe something even more controversial, scholars have had time to analyze Justice Thomas's statement in the cert denial and Malwarebytes. Do you all have any thoughts about his weighing in on C1 and C2?
I'll chime in here, and I did post a link to my blog post in the chat. I don't know if that got out to the attendees. I hope it did. And I'll simply put that Justice Thomas's statement at the end says, "I wrote this without the benefit of briefing, but the prior 10 pages are still credible." And of course, we know that judges are best when they're hearing both sides of a story, which wasn't the case in here. So it really was just Justice Thomas free associating with Section 230 in a way that I don't think improves the discourse. It really was, I think, a very unhelpful contribution to it.
I'll just add that, it's not unusual that justices express opinions in their denial of cert petitions and in their denial of cert petitions. And he was fully admitting that this had not been briefed, and he wasn't suggesting he was creating precedent. But I'd love to dig down into some of these arguments. So, maybe Eric or anyone else, if they want to sort of discuss this issue. his, I think, very salient argument that he and many others have made is nothing in C1 talks about distributor liability explicitly. Nothing in C1 says there shall be a blanket immunity from tort law. And so there is a very reasonable construction that C2 absolutely protects platforms when they do moderate. All the things that we want to protect when it comes to ensuring that there is editorial discretion on the part of platforms and that they can take down bad stuff. That's not the issue here, right? The issue right now we're talking about is C1, and there's a very reasonable interpretation that yes, you get protection if you're being, you can't be treated as a speaker, you can't be treated like a publisher, but there really is some ambiguity about whether Congress and whether this section precludes distributor liability, and there's a real question about whether it precludes holding platforms liable for ordinary negligence. Even Senator Wyden and Congressman Cox said in their reply to the FCC, they did not intend to disturb ordinary negligence liability. But the way the courts have interpreted it, they have. And if we know that the FCC has jurisdiction here, is what's unlawful, what's incorrect about Thomas's statement that there's another reasonable construction of C1?
So this is, in my mind, just like a basic reading comprehension test. The statute says that providers or users of interactive computer services shall not be treated as a publisher. The way that Justice Thomas tried to position the issue, and others have tried as well, is say that means that the only thing that was excluded was the only category of liability that is exclusively held to publishers. But that's not what it says. It doesn't say they will not be treated as publisher for the only things that are uniquely liable, that publishers are uniquely liable for. It says they won't be treated as publishers. So adding extra words into the statute is exactly what a textualist shouldn't do.
Yeah, but there's three categories, right? In under ordinary libel law, there's a category of speaker, publisher, and distributor. And it is the word distributor is noticeably absent. If you look through any libel treatise, you'll see that distributors are subject to a separate standard than publishers. And it was absolutely the question, right? Because in Stratton Oakmont, Prodigy was being treated like a publisher. And that's what offended everybody. They were trying to do the right thing and moderate. And because they moderated, they were being treated like a publisher, which is subject to a much lower standard. A publisher can be held culpable even if they don't know about the actual defamation. Distributors are subject to a very different standard. They can only be held liable if they knew or should have known about the libelous material. There's no mention of distributor. So it's a perfectly reasonable interpretation that Congress was worried about speaker liability and publisher liability, but not concerned about distributor liability. It may
There's no reason to mention the word distributor because saying that they're not treated as publisher covers all categories of liability that publishers would be exposed to. So you can keep claiming that it's perfectly reasonable, but I think that the statute is very clear on its face. If it would have been a liability that publishers would have faced, it doesn't apply, period.
But there is an ambiguity there. That's my only point. It is not irrational to make the argument I just made that Supreme Court Justice Thomas just made. And it may not win the day, but it is an argument that the FCC could adopt. And it doesn't cause the parade of horribles that everybody is worried about. You still have C2, you still have protection for speech. Platforms still can't be held culpable unless they know about the defamation. But what it helps is all the other problems, all the horrible torts that are not about speech, but about action, about drug trafficking, about child sex materials, all the stuff that really I don't think anybody envisioned this applying to, right? Even Congressman Cox said he wasn't sure Backpage was decided appropriately. These are not issues about speech torts. These are issues about negligence, about recklessness, and about people being harmed from actual conduct, not from speech. All I'm saying is there's a reasonable construction there. And so I don't think you can say it's an impossible construction or unlawful. It's just a different view, a reasonable one, and one that could be adopted.
Great. I'm going to move on to audience questions. And here are a few good ones. So are there differences across countries that teach us something about 230 content moderation? So I think the United Kingdom has implemented their content moderation regime, and there's been some talk of European efforts. Do they inform the US conversation?
The Europe conversations are something that we're tracking very closely at CDT right now. So the Digital Services Act consultation is moving forward and does raise a lot of these same questions. It happens against a different backdrop without the First Amendment. They're raising some of the same concerns. But some of the things that we're watching the most actively in that space are conversations about how the notice and action framework is working over there. And in particular, the lack of certainty that that notice and action framework has created for platforms and for users in the time since its adoption. In that instance, there's a framework, right? If you receive notice of illegal content, there's an obligation to take it down. The lack of certainty as to what triggers that notice obligation, what types of requirements lead to that obligation requiring action, have led to a lot of uncertainty and real concerns about over takedowns, over moderation by platforms because they are concerned about these issues. So you have very famous examples, right, of human rights watchdog groups uploading content for purposes of revealing crimes against humanity, and instead those get taken down under the fear that it might be terrorist content. There are plenty of other instances that fall into that category as well, of speech being responded to, in particular by marginalized groups, because of a concern that it is extremist content. So for us, one of the key things there that we're pushing for in the DSA consultation is to really make sure we use this opportunity to clarify the notice and action framework in Europe, to set up much clearer safeguards and certainty about what speech needs to be taken down when, to make sure that it's after a formal process, and to make sure that there are effective counter notices in place so that people whose content is being removed have an opportunity to know that that is happening and to be able to speak up to defend their case as to why it should stay up. The other lesson that is very active in Europe, and I think an essential one that we need to continue thinking about, is this concern about monitoring or content filtering. So this general obligation on platforms that they should be looking at everything that comes across their services to act against it. That is a very slippery slope, enormously troubling, and one that we all need to be focusing on as well.
The other thing I would add, Sarah, and I mentioned this a little bit in my opening recorded remarks, is that for us, I mean, this is a question about really what values do we want to have for tech in our country. We certainly want a democracy. We want a free and open environment that encourages innovation. We want to encourage a democratic society. In our reply comments to the FCC, we raised concerns about, basically taking away the regime and mirroring kind of an authoritarian government like China. That is not something that we want to do. Also, our view is that if we hamper innovation in the US, then China is hot on our heels to, kind of win the race to tech. And these are conversations that are not happening in a bubble, right? This is not confined to 230. This is big right now when we talk about 5G, we talk about security, we're thinking about Huawei, we're thinking about ZTE, we're thinking about all the countries that are on the entity list and everything that the Department of Commerce and DHS are working hard on. And it's interesting that I think the same themes that we're seeing in that space are just not transferring here.
Again, I think it's important to remember there's a difference between Section 230 and the First Amendment, no matter what we do with Section 230. And many of us are saying, amend it, not remove it. But no matter what happens with Section 230, we're not repealing the First Amendment. I do not think there's a fear of authoritarian regimes like China just because we've modified Section 230.
But if you do have directives towards platforms to somehow look and see what is neutral on a platform, what is too conservative, what is too liberal, then that really does get into questions. Yes, there's a First Amendment, and one would hope that you go to court and that can be taken care of. But we saw before Section 230 that things were not always happening in a way that was either predictable or that were the best outcomes for free speech in this country.
But again, I did not hear Chairman Pai say he's planning on compelling or prohibiting any speech. All these things he's going to construe Section 230. And remember, he needs 3 votes to do so.
We did read the NTIA petition, Neil, and I mean, I think Eric would probably agree with me as he's laughing in the background a little bit, right? I mean, that was perhaps more than Chairman Pai's remarks reflected. And obviously I can't speak to what Chairman Pai plans to do or not do from that petition, but the petition was concerning. The petition suggests platform neutrality, and whether or not you like the merits of net neutrality, which you all know, I don't, you didn't, but I don't think that's a road that we want to go down here.
Related to determining neutrality, fairness doctrine, we do have kind of an experiment to watch. Facebook's oversight board has started taking cases. And so that's an effort to have kind of a third party set of people looking at content. What do you all think about the independence of such a board? Should it be with industry? Are government actors better able to oversee content? How does that fit into this discussion?
I'm all for voluntary efforts, but I still think that there has to be a way to question the voluntary effort of the private entity, right? That's what tort law is, right? We can all act voluntarily. We all hope that everyone will act ethically and morally, but there's a reason why we have laws. Sometimes people don't do the right thing. It may not be intentional. It may just be reckless. It may just be negligent, but I do think there needs to be a backstop. And so while I applaud anyone who's trying to wrestle with this issue, which is not easy, I do think we need the backstop of court review. So I wouldn't create a whole new agency. I would let the platforms do what they want, right, to try and reasonably address these problems and let a court decide whether in fact they were reasonable, whether or not someone has a valid claim of harm under tort law.
I don't have any comments on the legal implications of the oversight board, but happy to talk about them. The only thing I would observe is I think it's a really interesting initiative. I think there's a lot of we can learn from the experiment, but only a company like Facebook and maybe Google would have the resources to create such a complex, procedure-laden organization like that. So I look at the oversight board as an interesting experiment, but not one that I think predicts what the rest of the industry should move to. I think we should look at this as Facebook's trying something new for its community, and other communities are going to try other things as well.
I'll chime in to say the same. I think it's laudable in many respects in terms of the effort to establish broader processes, right? That's something a lot of us have been calling for a long time, is more transparency, more due process to help govern these. And that clearly is an effort to do it in a formalistic way. The important aspect of this is that because of the First Amendment, it continues to create strict parameters on what legislation could require. So no matter what you think, we need to focus on how these voluntary initiatives are going to try and make them as good and effective as possible. There's a robust and healthy conversation happening about the efficacy of the oversight board, conversations about the fact that it's about appealing takedown decisions as opposed to leave up decisions. I think some real questions about the adequacy of a panel of this size being able to adjudicate issues that arise from around the world, particularly when the vast majority of Facebook users are outside the US and very many, more than half, are non-English speaking users. So there are those types of concerns that I think we need to pay watchful attention to, including the speed with which their decisions can be reached. But these are the types of creative efforts that we need in this space to help address concerns and to help innovate in terms of how companies are most effectively doing content moderation and trying to create checks and more formal processes on their own internal decision-making as well.
In a related audience question, is there a concern that modifying 230 by allowing suits for reckless behavior would lead to a litigation explosion?
So what I would suggest is that those that are worried about litigation, including the platforms, should entertain joining the tort reform movement, right? If we're worried about litigiousness, let's address litigiousness. I don't know why platforms should be subject to a different standard than every other business in America. I'm not taking a position on tort reform, but we have a tort reform conversation happening. If the concern is about litigiousness, let's have that conversation. Let's not do a carve out for platforms who I think we are all concerned are, you know, as everything moves to the internet, we're seeing, as Eric points out, people do bad things, but we have laws, we have tort law to address when people do bad things, when people are negligent. But for some reason, we've carved out platforms from that regime. That's, I think, where we should focus. Why just platforms?
The answer why is because, and I don't use the term platforms, I talk about internet services, because they're publishing third-party content, and that's a speech generating and infrastructure generating service that is different from slinging burgers or serving pizzas. So when we have those kinds of generative activities that create spaces for people to engage in conversation with each other, I do think there's reasons for us to think about them differently than other types of categories of business. And I do think that when we talk about potential litigation exposure, it's so easy to dismiss the concern because Google and Facebook can handle it. They got the money to be able to afford all the lawsuits that could be thrown at them. But many services simply don't. And the threat of litigation distorts their decision-making in order to avoid the risk of getting a lawsuit, not winning a lawsuit, but getting a lawsuit. They're going to change their behavior in ways that are going to have ripple effects throughout the conversations that we're having today that I hope ultimately are benefiting those communities. Last thing I'd say, I do support a form of reform in this area. I do think that a federal anti-SLAPP law would help address some of the risks of litigation here by helping identify those lawsuits that are truly abusive. And there are such lawsuits filed. A federal anti-SLAPP law would help provide a recourse for those particular categories of lawsuits.
I do think Eric makes a good point that folks do like to say that this is all about Twitter and Facebook and other big platforms because they, make the news headlines and the president tweets about them and, we're all on them and we all pay attention. But there are so many businesses that are out there that are just doing their day-to-day work that you're never thinking about, right? There's web hosting, there's managed cloud services, there's all these businesses that are actually small and medium and that are just doing the business of running the internet, and they're not hosting political content. So we really do have to think about how any reforms that we might be talking about in this area impact them.
And I agree, but the good news there is the existing reasonable standard of negligence does that. A smaller platform will have less content and therefore less to moderate. It will have less resources and not as much will be expected of it. What's reasonable for the small upstart is not what's reasonable for Facebook, is not what's reasonable for Google. And so the courts have already addressed these problems from the beginning of tort law. And so I get the concern, but I think there's a way to address that just the way tort law does today.
They still have to go to court.
You've made another empirically unsupported claim, and I doubt we're going to have time for you to defend it. You made the claim that smaller services are going to face less liability because they have a less amount of content. But in fact, one of the beauties of the internet is that it can provide highly leveraged services where small services can provide massive value and have large, massive databases with not a lot of resources. That's actually the beauty of the internet, that ability to reduce transaction costs and the cost of getting to market so that small services can have huge databases with not a lot of revenue. And so all those circumstances you're describing, that empirical claim doesn't actually reflect the internet.
But you realize you've just made also an unsupportable empirical claim because you don't know that they're going to see a lot of litigation if they're small. Your claim that there will be this flood of litigation is just as unsupportable as my position that the proper incentives will lead to additional, more healthy moderation. Both of those.
So Neil, I do track every lawsuit that I can find that relates to a wide variety of services. And so I'm happy to share with you and anyone else who wants it, the list of, for example, the cases involving content suspension or removal or account termination removal. There are dozens of cases in that area. And these are cases that fail on their face. They don't even make it past the motion to dismiss.
Right.
If there were a different legal standard, we could multiply that by 10x, 100x, maybe 1,000x. So, I'm tracking the cases. There are dozens of them today, and they're all failing under the existing rule.
And I guess one final audience question. Karl raises an interesting point. Lots of people thought the EO was a joke, and yet here we are. What kind of process explains that change? And maybe just to wrap up, what can we look forward to with hearings coming up soon with the CEOs of these big companies?
I just wanted to say that Clarence Thomas's statement was a pretty major development. I mean, somebody said earlier that they described it as something that's unhelpful, but if you ask Republicans on the Hill, they would say the exact opposite. And they're definitely going to be pointing to that statement when Section 230 conversations come up, as well as the New York Post article. I mean, that's just more fuel. Instead of talking about Project Veritas, Ted Cruz is now going to be talking about that article.
I think the question you asked, Sarah, is why has the EO led to so much ripple effects throughout the rest of the federal government? And I think it really is a sign of how far our federal government has fallen in terms of serving the American people. What each of the developments that we've discussed that have been run by the executive branch are really all part of a larger concerted effort to help Trump with his re-election campaign. Why was there Ajit releasing his statement now? Why didn't he wait a couple of weeks? Why was the DOJ pulling the trigger on a lawsuit against Google now, as opposed to waiting a couple of weeks? These are all tied to the federal to Trump's reelection campaign, and the fact that our government was so easily corrupted there really makes us question what are the checks and balances we have in our system to make sure that the people who we're paying with our tax dollars, I don't get a choice whether they pay my tax dollars, are using that money to do things that are adverse to the American people. So I think a lot depends on what happens in the election. If Trump is reelected, we will only see far more of this activity where the federal government isn't serving the American people, it's serving Trump. And if Trump is not reelected, I'm hoping that we will then go to what I would consider to be a normal discussion about what's in the best interest of American people.
Great, thank you. Well, on that note, there's so much more to watch in the next few weeks, and at this rate, Section 230 news changes every day. I just want to say thank you to the panelists for sharing their expertise and thoughts, and we'll continue watching what happens with Section 230 proposals and reforms in the coming months. Thank you.